What happens when the most carefully guarded secrets of royalty come crashing down in the most public way possible? When years of perfectly crafted lies suddenly unravel before the eyes of millions, leaving nothing but raw truth and unexpected laughter in their wake. This is the story of how one moment changed everything for the British royal family, how Camilla's carefully constructed world came tumbling down, and how Prince William's reaction became the talk of the entire kingdom. Sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, and sometimes, just sometimes, that truth is so shocking that even those closest to the situation can't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Clarence's house as Camilla sat at her mahogany desk, carefully reviewing the day's schedule with her private secretary, Margaret. Everything had to be perfect. Every public appearance, every charitable engagement, every carefully worded statement to the press needed to align with the image she had spent decades building. The Queen Consort had learned long ago that perception was everything in the royal world, and she had become a master at crafting the perfect narrative. "Your Royal Highness, the children's hospital visit is scheduled for 2 o'clock, Margaret said, adjusting her glasses as she flipped through the leather-bound planner. "The photographers will be positioned at the main entrance, and we've prepared talking points about your commitment to pediatric care." Camilla nodded absently, her mind elsewhere. She was thinking about the conversation she'd had with Charles the night before, another one of their whispered discussions about maintaining appearances. The king had been stressed lately, worried about public opinion polls and the constant scrutiny from both the media and members of parliament. The monarchy's approval ratings had been fluctuating, and every misstep seemed to be magnified tenfold in the press. "Make sure the photographers capture me reading to the children," Camilla instructed, applying her signature red lipstick with practiced precision. "The public loves those intimate moments. They make me seem more relatable." What the public didn't know was that Camilla had never particularly enjoyed being around children. She found them unpredictable and exhausting, their honest reactions often uncomfortable for someone who lived her life so carefully scripted. But she had learned to play the role perfectly, complete with the warm smiles and gentle touches that photographers love to capture. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her old friend Diana Worthington, someone she had known since their school days together. The message was brief, but concerning. "Camilla, we need to talk. It's about the Cornwall property. Call me when you're alone." A chill ran down Camilla's spine. The Cornwall property was supposed to be a closely guarded secret, a private retreat she had purchased years ago under a shell company name. She had told Charles it belonged to a distant cousin who let her use it occasionally. The truth was far more complicated, and if it ever came to light, it could unravel everything she had worked so hard to build. She quickly deleted the message and tried to push the worry from her mind. There were more immediate concerns to handle. The palace staff had been whispering about strange phone calls coming in over the past few days, journalists asking probing questions about her past, her finances, and her relationships before marrying Charles. Usually, these inquiries were routine and easily deflected by the communications team, but something felt different this time. "Margaret," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "I want you to contact the communications department. Tell them I want to know exactly what questions the press has been asking about me lately. I want details, not just summaries." Margaret looked up from her planner, sensing the tension in her employer's voice. She had worked for Camilla for 8 years and had learned to read her moods carefully. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Is there anything specific you're concerned about?" "Just do it," Camilla snapped, then immediately softened her tone. She couldn't afford to let her anxiety show, not even to her most trusted staff member. "I simply want to stay ahead of any potential stories. You know how the tabloids can be." As Margaret left to make the calls, Camilla walked to the window overlooking the garden. The carefully manicured landscape below reflected the life she had built for herself, beautiful on the surface, but requiring constant maintenance to keep everything in its proper place. She thought about all the small lies she had told over the years, each one seeming insignificant at the time, but collectively forming a web that she sometimes feared might entangle her. There was the lie about her first marriage ending amicably when it had actually been quite bitter. The lie about never having financial difficulties when she had, in fact, been deeply in debt before marrying Charles. The lie about her relationship with the press, pretending to be uncomfortable with media attention when she had actually cultivated relationships with certain journalists to ensure favorable coverage. But the biggest lie of all was about her relationship with Charles during his marriage to Diana. The official story was that their romance had only rekindled after his divorce, but the truth was far messier. There had been overlapping relationships, secret meetings, and carefully orchestrated cover-ups that had required the cooperation of multiple staff members and friends. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed it was William. Her stepson's relationship with her had always been cordial, but distant. He was respectful in public, played his role as the dutiful stepson, but she knew he harbored reservations about her. There was something in his eyes whenever they spoke privately, a skepticism that made her uncomfortable. "Hello, William," she answered, keeping her voice warm and maternal despite her growing unease. "Camilla," his voice sounded strained, "we need to meet. Today, there's something we need to discuss, and it can't wait." Her heart began to race. "Of course, dear. Is everything all right? You sound concerned." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and she could hear muffled voices in the background. "I'd rather discuss it in person. Can you come to Kensington Palace this afternoon? Around 3? I have the hospital visit at 2, but I can rearrange things," she said, her mind racing through possibilities. What could have prompted this sudden meeting? Had someone said something to him? Had he discovered something he wasn't supposed to know? "Don't rearrange anything," William said firmly. "This can wait until after your engagement." "But, Camilla, we really do need to talk." After he hung up, Camilla sat in silence for several minutes, staring at her phone. The morning that had started with routine planning was quickly becoming something else entirely. She tried to tell herself it was probably nothing, maybe just some family matter or protocol question. But, deep in her heart, she knew something was wrong. Margaret returned with a concerned expression on her face. "Your Royal Highness, I spoke with the communications team. They said there have been some unusual inquiries lately, particularly from investigative journalists. They're asking about property records, financial transactions from the early 2000s, and—" She hesitated. "And what?" Camilla demanded. "They're asking about a woman named Sarah Mitchell. Do you know anyone by that name?" The color drained from Camilla's face. Sarah Mitchell was a name from her past that she had hoped would never surface again. Sarah had been her closest confidant during some of her most difficult years, the keeper of secrets that could destroy everything Camilla had built. But Sarah had moved to Australia over a decade ago, and they had lost touch. Why would journalists be asking about her now? I may have known someone by that name years ago," Camilla said carefully. "Did they say why they were asking?" "No, but they seemed very interested in locating her. The communications team told them we don't comment on Her Royal Highness's private relationships, but they were quite persistent." Camilla's mind was spinning. If journalists had found Sarah, if they had convinced her to talk, there was no telling what might come out. Sarah knew about the Cornwall property, about the financial arrangements Charles wasn't aware of, about the extent of her relationship with certain members of the press, and, most damaging of all, about the timeline of her relationship with Charles. She excused Margaret, and spent the next hour making phone calls to old friends and contacts, trying to gather information without seeming too desperate. But each conversation left her more worried than the last. Several people mentioned seeing Sarah's name in the news recently, something about her returning to England for her mother's funeral. If Sarah was back in the country, and if she was talking to journalists. The hospital visit passed in a blur of forced smiles and carefully rehearsed interactions. The photographers captured exactly the images her team wanted, but Camilla's mind was elsewhere. She found herself watching the journalists in attendance more carefully than usual, wondering if any of them were the ones asking questions about her past. During the drive to Kensington Palace, she tried to prepare herself for whatever William wanted to discuss. She rehearsed various explanations and denials, but without knowing exactly what he had discovered, it was impossible to craft the perfect response. For the first time in years, she felt truly out of control of her own narrative. The palace staff greeted her with their usual deference, but she imagined she could see something different in their expressions, a hint of curiosity or concern that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps she was simply being paranoid, letting her anxiety color her perceptions. William met her in his private office, a room she had been in dozens of times before but which somehow felt different today. More formal, more intimidating. He was standing by the window when she entered, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that reminded her uncomfortably of his father. "William," she began, settling into the chair across from his desk, "you sounded quite serious on the phone. What's troubling you?" He turned to face her, and she was struck by the expression in his eyes. There was something there she had never seen before when he looked at her, disappointment mixed with what might have been amusement. It was an unsettling combination. Camilla, he said, moving to sit behind his desk. I've received some information today that I think you should know about. Information that affects not just you, but the entire family. Her mouth went dry, but she maintained her composure. What kind of information? William opened a folder on his desk and pulled out what appeared to be a collection of documents and photographs. A journalist contacted my office this morning. Normally, these inquiries go through the proper channels, but this one was different. He had evidence, Camilla. Evidence of things that, well, things that don't align with what you've told us about your past. The room seemed to tilt slightly, but Camilla forced herself to remain calm. I'm not sure what you mean, William. What kind of evidence? Property records showing you own the Cornwall estate outright, purchased with funds that can't be traced to any legitimate source. He slid a document across the desk. Bank transfers from 2019 to a Sarah Mitchell in Australia. Payments that seemed designed to keep her quiet about something. Another document joined the first. And photographs, Camilla. Photographs of you and my father together during his marriage to my mother. Timestamps that contradict everything you've both said about when your relationship resumed. Camilla stared at the documents, her mind racing. How had they found all this? How had she been so careless? She looked up at William, trying to gauge his mood, trying to determine how much damage had already been done. William, I can explain all of this, she began. But he held up a hand to stop her. The journalist is planning to publish his story tomorrow, he continued. He wanted to give us a chance to respond, which is why he contacted me directly. He thought, given my position as heir to the throne, I should know what was coming. The implications hit her like a physical blow. If this story ran in the papers, it wouldn't just embarrass her, it would damage Charles, potentially destabilize the monarchy itself. The public was already skeptical about the royal family's finances and their commitment to transparency. This kind of revelation could be catastrophic. What exactly does he plan to publish? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William's expression was unreadable as he leaned back in his chair. Everything, Camilla. The secret property, the payments to keep people quiet, the lies about the timeline of your relationship with my father. He's calling it the Queen Consort's web of deception. As the full weight of the situation settled over her, Camilla realized that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. All the lies, all the careful management, all the perfect appearances were about to be exposed for what they truly were. And, from the look in William's eyes, she could tell that he already knew far more than she had ever intended for him to discover. The facade she had spent decades building was finally beginning to crack, and she had no idea how to stop what was coming next. The silence in William's office stretched uncomfortably as Camilla stared at the documents spread across his desk. Her mind raced through possible explanations, damage control strategies, and ways to minimize the fallout from what was about to become the biggest scandal of her royal career. But, for the first time in decades, she felt completely unprepared for the conversation she was about to have. William watched her carefully, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger, exactly, though she had expected fury. It wasn't disappointment, though that would have been understandable. There was something else there, something that made her even more uncomfortable than outright hostility would have. How long have you known? She finally asked, her voice steadier than she felt. About what specifically? William replied, leaning forward slightly. About the Cornwall property? About the payments to Sarah Mitchell? Or about the fact that you and my father were having an affair for years longer than either of you admitted? The directness of his questions caught her off guard. This wasn't the diplomatic, careful conversation she had expected from someone trained in royal protocol from birth. This was something much more personal and much more dangerous to her position. William, you have to understand, she began, falling back on the tone she had used successfully with Charles and other family members when difficult topics arose. The situation was complicated. Your father and I never intended for things to develop the way they did. We were trying to protect everyone involved, including your mother. Something shifted in William's expression at the mention of his mother, and, for a moment, Camilla thought she had made a serious tactical error. But, instead of anger, she saw something that looked almost like amusement beginning to form around his eyes. Protect my mother, he repeated, and there was definitely something new in his voice now. Camilla, I've spent most of my adult life believing that narrative. We all have. The story about how you and my father only got back together after my parents' marriage was truly over, about how you kept your distance out of respect for my mother, about how you never wanted to cause additional pain to our family. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where photographers often gathered to catch glimpses of royal family members. Do you know what the most interesting part of this journalist's investigation was? It wasn't the financial irregularities, though those are certainly damaging. It wasn't even the timeline of your affair, though that will certainly cause problems when it becomes public. Camilla felt her stomach clench. What was it? William turned back to her, and now she could clearly see what she had been unable to identify before. He was trying not to laugh. The future King of England was struggling to contain his amusement at her situation, and she had no idea why. The most interesting part, he said, walking back to his desk and picking up a photograph she hadn't noticed before, was discovering just how many people have known the truth for years and said nothing. Do you recognize this picture? He handed her a photograph that made her blood run cold. It showed her and Charles at a private dinner party in 1994, clearly intimate, clearly together as a couple, at a time when they had both insisted publicly that their relationship was purely friendship. But what made the photograph truly devastating wasn't just the obvious intimacy between them. It was the other people visible in the background. She recognized at least 6 faces in that photograph, all people who had maintained their silence for decades, all people who had supported the official story of her relationship with Charles. But now, apparently, at least one of them had decided to speak to journalists. Who gave this to the reporter? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. That's the beautiful part, William said, and there was definitely laughter in his voice now. He didn't get it from any of the people in the photograph. He got it from my mother's private collection. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. What? Apparently, my mother had quite an extensive collection of photographs and documents related to your relationship with my father. She was much more aware of what was going on than any of us realized. The journalist found the collection when he was researching her personal papers, which were donated to a historical archive last year. Camilla felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Diana had known. Diana had documented their relationship, and now, years after her death, that documentation was being used to expose everything Camilla had worked so hard to keep hidden. But how did a journalist get access to those papers? She asked weakly. William's smile became more pronounced. That's where it gets really interesting, Camilla. The papers weren't restricted. My mother made sure of that in her will. She specifically stated that her personal papers should be made available to researchers and historians after a 20-year period. That period ended last year. The implications were staggering. Diana hadn't just known about the affair, she had planned for this revelation. She had documented everything and ensured that the truth would eventually come to light, long after her death, when it would cause maximum damage to Camilla's reputation and position within the royal family. There's more, William continued, clearly enjoying her distress now. The journalist has been in contact with Sarah Mitchell. She's been quite cooperative, apparently. She's provided bank records showing the payments you made to her, along with detailed accounts of conversations you had about keeping certain information private. She's also provided recordings. Recordings? Camilla's voice was barely audible. Phone conversations between the two of you, dating back several years. Conversations where you discuss various lies you've told the family, strategies for maintaining your public image, and some particularly interesting comments about your feelings toward my mother and her sons. Camilla closed her eyes, trying to remember what she might have said to Sarah over the years. Their conversations had been private, or so she had thought. She had vented frustrations, shared concerns about public perception, and, yes, she had probably said things about Diana and her children that she wouldn't want made public. William, she said, opening her eyes and trying to salvage what she could from this disaster. I know this looks bad, but you have to understand the pressure I've been under. The public scrutiny, the constant comparison to your mother, the need to prove myself worthy of your father's love, and the crown. I may have said things or done things that weren't entirely truthful, but it was all in service of protecting the monarchy and our family's reputation. William sat back down, and his expression shifted again. The amusement was still there, but it was mixed with something that looked like pity now. Camilla, he said gently, do you know what the most damaging revelation in this story is? It's not the affair timeline. The public has suspected that for years. It's not the financial irregularities, though those will certainly cause problems. It's not even the recordings of you bad-mouthing my mother, though those will hurt. She waited, dreading what he might say next. It's the fact that you've been lying to my father about all of this too. The Cornwall property that he thinks belongs to your cousin? He's going to find out you own it outright and have been using it for private meetings with journalists and other contacts. The financial support you told him you've been providing to distant relatives? He's going to discover you've been paying people to keep quiet about your past. The complete honesty you promised him when you married. He's going to see evidence that you've continued lying to him about dozens of things, right up until yesterday. The full horror of the situation began to dawn on her. It wasn't just her public reputation that was about to be destroyed, it was her marriage. Charles valued honesty above almost everything else, and the revelation that she had been systematically lying to him about major aspects of her life would be devastating to their relationship. The journalist contacted my office because he wanted to give us a chance to prepare, William continued. He's not interested in bringing down the monarchy or even necessarily destroying your marriage. He's interested in the truth, and he believes the public deserves to know the real story behind one of the most scrutinized relationships in royal history. What does he want? She asked desperately. Money? An exclusive interview? Access to other information? William's smile returned, and this time it was definitely accompanied by barely suppressed laughter. That's the thing, Camilla. He doesn't want anything from us. He already has everything he needs. The story is going to print tomorrow morning regardless of what we do or say. The finality of that statement hit her like a physical blow. There was no negotiating, no damage control, no way to stop what was coming. Everything she had built, every lie she had carefully constructed, every secret she had thought was safely buried, was about to be exposed to the entire world. There is one thing, though, William added, his tone becoming more serious. The journalist has agreed to delay publication for 24 hours if we can provide him with additional information that might give his story more context or balance. What kind of additional information? He wants to interview you. On the record. About everything. The property, the payments, the timeline of your relationship with my father, your feelings about my mother, your thoughts on becoming queen consort, all of it. Camilla stared at him in disbelief. You want me to participate in my own destruction? I don't want you to do anything, William replied. This is entirely your choice. But I thought you should know that the option exists. You could tell your side of the story, provide context for your actions, maybe even generate some sympathy for the impossible position you've been in. She could see the trap clearly now. If she agreed to the interview, she would be admitting to everything and probably making things worse with additional revelations. If she refused, the story would run without her input, making her look guilty and secretive. How much does your father know? She asked quietly. Nothing yet. I wanted to speak with you first. As a courtesy. The word courtesy stung, delivered as it was with that hint of amusement still in William's voice. She was beginning to realize that he was enjoying this situation far more than he should be. But why? What did he gain from her downfall? William, she said, trying one last desperate approach. We're family now. I know we haven't always been close, but I've tried to be a good stepmother to you and Harry. I've supported your father through difficult times. I've played my role in maintaining the dignity of the crown. Doesn't that count for something? For a moment, his expression softened, and she thought she might have found a way to reach him. But then he spoke, and his words demolished any hope she had of enlisting his support. Camilla, do you remember the conversation we had after your wedding to my father? You asked me what I thought about your new role in our family, and I told you I thought you could bring my father happiness, which was what mattered most to me. She nodded, remembering the conversation. It had been one of the few genuinely warm moments they had shared. What I didn't tell you then, he continued, was that I had already decided to wait and see what kind of person you really were when you thought no one was watching. I've been waiting for almost 20 years, Camilla, and now I know. The coldness in his voice made her shiver. All these years, she had thought their relationship was simply distant, but respectful. She had never realized he had been watching her, evaluating her, waiting for her to reveal her true character. And what kind of person do you think I am? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. William stood up again, signaling that their conversation was coming to an end. I think you're someone who has spent so many years crafting lies and managing perceptions that you've lost track of who you really are underneath it all. I think you're someone who has convinced herself that everything you've done has been for the good of others, when it's really been about protecting and advancing yourself. He walked to the door and opened it, clearly dismissing her. The journalist's name is David Morrison. His contact information is on the card attached to those documents. If you decide you want to tell your side of the story, you have until tomorrow morning to contact him. After that, the story runs with or without your cooperation. As Camilla gathered the documents and prepared to leave, she turned back to William one last time. What will you tell your father? The smile returned to his face, and this time he didn't try to hide his amusement at all. The truth, Camilla. All of it. For the first time in 20 years, I'm going to tell him the complete, unvarnished truth about the woman he married. As she walked out of Kensington Palace, Camilla realized that her world was about to change forever. But what disturbed her most wasn't the prospect of public humiliation or even the possible end of her marriage. It was the sound that followed her down the corridor as she left William's office. The sound of him laughing, quietly but unmistakably, at the spectacular collapse of everything she had worked so hard to build. The 24 hours following Camilla's meeting with William passed like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. She had returned to Clarence's house in a state of barely controlled panic, her mind racing through impossible scenarios for damage control. Sleep had been elusive, coming in brief snatches between hours of staring at the ceiling and replaying every conversation, every decision, every lie that had led her to this moment. She had called David Morrison, the journalist, at 11 that night, hoping to negotiate some kind of arrangement. His voice had been professional but firm when he explained that the story was already set for publication. He offered again to include her perspective, but made it clear that nothing she could say would fundamentally change the nature of the revelations. The truth, he explained, was the truth, regardless of how it was contextualized. By dawn, Camilla had made a decision that surprised even herself. She would not run from this scandal or attempt to hide from its consequences. Instead, she would face it head-on, with as much dignity as she could muster. If her carefully constructed image was about to be destroyed, she would at least try to control the manner of its destruction. She arrived at Buckingham Palace at 7 in the morning, knowing that Charles would be in his private study reviewing his daily briefings. The morning routine had been the same for years. He would spend the first hour of each day reading reports from his staff, reviewing his schedule, and preparing for whatever challenges the day might bring. Today would be different. The palace corridors seemed unusually quiet as she made her way to Charles's study. The staff members she passed offered their customary bows and greetings, but she imagined she could see questions in their eyes. Did they already know? Had word of the impending scandal already begun to spread through the palace's informal network of gossip and speculation? She knocked softly on the study door and entered when Charles called for her to come in. He was seated behind his antique desk, wearing his reading glasses and examining what appeared to be a brief about agricultural policy. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows caught the silver in his hair, reminding her of how much they had both aged since their wedding day. "Darling," he said, looking up with the warm smile that had first captured her heart decades ago, "you're up early. I wasn't expecting to see you until this afternoon." The affection in his voice made what she was about to do infinitely more difficult. For a moment, she considered simply sitting down and pretending everything was normal, enjoying these last few hours before their world exploded around them. But she knew that would only make the inevitable revelation more painful for both of them. "Charles," she said, remaining standing despite his gesture toward the chair across from his desk, "we need to talk about something very serious." His expression shifted immediately, the warm smile fading into the concerned frown she had seen him wear during various family crises over the years. "What's wrong? You look as though you haven't slept." "I haven't," she admitted. "Charles, there's going to be a story in the newspapers this morning. About me. About us. About things I should have told you years ago." She watched as he set down the agricultural brief and removed his reading glasses, giving her his complete attention. The transformation from distracted monarch to concerned husband was immediate and complete. "What kind of story?" he asked quietly. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind dozens of times during the sleepless night, trying to find the right words to explain decades of deception to the man she loved. But now, facing him directly, all of her carefully planned explanations seemed inadequate. "The Cornwall property," she began. "The one I told you belonged to my cousin? I own it. I've owned it for 15 years. I purchased it with money that, well, with money that came from sources you don't know about." Charles's expression didn't change immediately, but she could see him processing this information, trying to understand its implications. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Why would you lie about owning property? And what sources?" "Camilla, you're frightening me." The gentleness in his voice almost broke her resolve. She had expected anger, accusations, immediate demands for explanations. Instead, he was treating her with the same patient concern he might show to someone who was clearly in distress. "There's more," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she committed fully to the confession. "I've been making payments to Sarah Mitchell, my old friend who moved to Australia. Payments to ensure her discretion about certain aspects of our relationship during your marriage to Diana." Now she saw the change she had been expecting. Charles's face went very still, and something shifted behind his eyes. What aspects? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. The timeline, Charles. We weren't as careful as we thought we were. There are photographs, documents, evidence that our relationship resumed much earlier than we've ever admitted publicly. Years earlier. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Charles set his glasses down on the desk with deliberate precision, the small sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. When he spoke again, his voice was different, colder, more formal. How much earlier? She closed her eyes, knowing that her next words would fundamentally change their relationship forever. 1992, maybe even late 1991. The implications hung in the air between them. If their relationship had resumed in 1991 or 1992, it meant they had been together throughout some of the most difficult periods of Charles's marriage to Diana, during the separations and reconciliations that had been so painfully public, during the years when Charles had been telling his wife and his family that his relationship with Camilla was purely friendship. The journalist has recordings, she continued, unable to stop now that she had begun. Conversations between Sarah and me where we discussed how to manage public perception, how to maintain certain stories, how to— She paused, struggling with the next admission. How to manage you, Charles. How to ensure you never discovered the extent of what I was hiding. She opened her eyes and looked at him directly, seeing in his face a mixture of hurt, anger, and something that might have been disappointment. But there was also something else, something she couldn't quite identify. Is there more? He asked quietly. The money I used to buy the Cornwall property came from selling information to certain journalists over the years. Nothing damaging to you or the monarchy, but insights into palace life, family dynamics, personal details that the press was willing to pay for. I told myself it was harmless, that I was actually helping to control the narrative by providing friendly journalists with positive stories about us. Charles stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in the same pose she had seen William adopt the day before. The similarity between father and son in that moment was striking and somehow ominous. How long have you been planning to tell me this? He asked without turning around. I never planned to tell you, she admitted. I hoped it would never come to light. I thought I had managed everything carefully enough that it would remain private forever. But something changed. William knows. The journalist contacted him yesterday with all the evidence. The story is running this morning regardless of what we do. Charles turned back to face her, and what she saw in his expression surprised her. Instead of the fury she had expected, instead of the devastation she had feared causing, there was something that looked almost like relief. Do you know what the most difficult part of the last 20 years has been for me, Camilla? She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. It's been the constant feeling that there were things you weren't telling me. Important things. I knew you were managing your public image carefully, as we all do. I knew you were concerned about public opinion and media coverage. But there were always gaps in your stories, inconsistencies in your explanations, moments when I could tell you were being less than completely honest. He walked back to his desk, but didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned against it, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. I told myself it was understandable. You were protecting yourself, protecting us, managing a difficult situation as best you could. I convinced myself that the details didn't matter, that what was important was our relationship in the present, not the exact truth about our past. She waited, still not sure whether this conversation was going better or worse than she had expected. But it's been exhausting, Camilla. Living with someone who you know is keeping significant secrets, trying to have an honest relationship with someone who isn't capable of complete honesty. I've been pretending not to notice the inconsistencies, pretending not to care about the gaps in your stories, pretending that a marriage based on partial truths could ever be truly satisfying. The words hit her harder than anger would have. He wasn't devastated by her revelations. He was relieved to finally have confirmation of what he had suspected for years. Charles, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. There's something you should know, he said. William called me last night after your meeting with him. He told me everything. She stared at him in shock. Everything. The property, the payments, the recordings, the timeline of our relationship, all of it. He thought I should know before the story broke, and he was right. Then, why did you let me go through this confession? Why didn't you tell me you already knew? For the first time since she had entered his study, Charles smiled. It wasn't the warm, affectionate smile she was accustomed to, but it wasn't entirely cold either. Because I wanted to see if you would finally tell me the truth when you had no other choice. I wanted to know if, even at the very end, You would choose honesty or try to manage the situation with more lies. She realized she was still standing and, suddenly, felt exhausted. The sleepless night, the stress of the confession, the realization that Charles had known everything all along. It all combined to make her feel as though she might collapse. "May I sit down?" she asked quietly. He gestured to the chair, and she sank into it gratefully. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 20 years of deception settling between them like a physical presence. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "Now we deal with the consequences," Charles replied. "The story will run, the press will have a field day, and we'll handle the aftermath as best we can. The monarchy has survived scandals before. It will survive this one too. And us? Our marriage." Charles was quiet for a long time, and when he finally answered, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. "I don't know, Camilla. I honestly don't know. The lies aren't just about the past anymore. They've been ongoing. You've been actively deceiving me about important things right up until yesterday. That's not something I can just overlook or forgive easily." She nodded, understanding that this was probably the best response she could have hoped for. He wasn't immediately demanding a separation or divorce, but he also wasn't pretending that everything could simply return to normal. "There's something else you should know," Charles continued, "about William's reaction to all this." "What about it?" "He's been laughing, Camilla. Not in a cruel way, exactly, but he finds the whole situation amusing." "Do you know why?" She shook her head, though she suspected she wasn't going to like the answer. "Because he's been waiting for this moment for years. He's known about most of your secrets for much longer than you realize. The palace staff aren't as discreet as you think they are, and William has always been very good at gathering information about people who are important to his family's welfare." The blood drained from her face. "How long has he known?" "About the property? 3 years. About the payments to Sarah Mitchell? 2 years. About the extent of our affair during my marriage to Diana? He's suspected since our wedding, but he's had confirmation for about 18 months. She felt as though she might be sick. All this time, she had thought she was successfully managing her secrets, carefully controlling information and maintaining her reputation. Instead, she had been living in a glass house, visible to anyone who cared to look closely enough. Why didn't he say anything sooner? Charles's smile returned, and this time there was definite amusement in his expression. "Because he wanted to see how long you would keep lying. He found it fascinating, watching you construct increasingly elaborate explanations for things he already knew the truth about. He's been documenting your deceptions for years, not because he planned to use them against you, but because he was curious about how far you would go to maintain your carefully crafted image." The full extent of her humiliation was beginning to dawn on her. Not only had her secrets been discovered, but her attempts to hide them had been treated as a form of entertainment by her stepson. She had been unwittingly performing in a drama where everyone else already knew the ending. "He's not angry with me?" she asked weakly. "Oh, he's angry," Charles replied. "But not about what you might expect. He's angry that you've been treating the rest of us as though we were stupid enough to believe your stories indefinitely. He's angry that you've been lying to me when he knew I deserved better. And he's angry that you've never once shown any genuine remorse for the pain your actions caused his mother." That last point hit her like a physical blow. She had never apologized for the affair, never acknowledged the hurt she had caused Diana. She had told herself that the past was the past, that what mattered was the present and future. But William had never forgotten, and apparently he had never forgiven. As if summoned by their conversation about him, there was a soft knock on the study door. Charles called for the visitor to enter, and William walked in, looking remarkably cheerful for someone who was about to watch his stepmother's public destruction. "Good morning," he said pleasantly, nodding to both of them. "I trust you've had a chance to discuss this morning's revelations." There was something almost gleeful in his tone, and Camilla finally understood why he had been laughing. This wasn't just about justice or truth, or even protecting his father. William was enjoying her downfall because he had been orchestrating it for years, patiently waiting for the right moment to watch her carefully constructed world collapse. "The story has already started appearing online," he continued, pulling out his phone and scrolling through what appeared to be news alerts. "The headlines are quite creative. Queen Consort's Secret Empire, the Camilla Files, 20 Years of Royal Deception. My personal favorite is How to Marry a King, a masterclass in strategic deception." Charles looked at his son with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "William, you seem to be enjoying this more than is entirely appropriate." William's smile was bright and completely unapologetic. "I'm enjoying it, actually. Is that terrible of me?" I'm enjoying watching someone who has spent decades manipulating situations and people finally face the consequences of their actions. I'm enjoying seeing truth finally triumph over carefully managed lies. And, yes, I'm enjoying the fact that the woman who hurt my mother and lied to my father is finally being held accountable." He turned to Camilla, and his expression became more serious but no less satisfied. "Did you really think you could keep all of this secret forever? Did you think no one would ever investigate your past or question your stories? Did you believe your own lies so completely that you forgot other people might be smart enough to see through them?" Before she could answer, William's phone buzzed with another alert. He glanced at it, and his smile became even broader. "Oh, this is interesting," he said. "Apparently Sarah Mitchell has agreed to a live television interview this afternoon. She's promising to reveal the Real Camilla Parker Bowles and to share recordings of conversations that show the calculating mind behind the royal facade." The room fell silent as the implications of this development sank in. It was one thing for the story to appear in newspapers, where it could be dismissed as tabloid gossip or investigative speculation. It was something else entirely for Sarah to appear on television with actual evidence, making specific claims about Camilla's character and behavior. "How bad are those recordings?" Charles asked quietly, the question directed at Camilla but with William clearly invited to hear the answer. Camilla closed her eyes and tried to remember all the conversations she had had with Sarah over the years. There had been so many, covering so many topics, expressing so many frustrations and fears and petty resentments. "Bad," she admitted quietly. "Probably very bad." William laughed, a sound that was becoming increasingly familiar and increasingly unsettling. "Well then," he said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "This is going to be quite an interesting day, isn't it?" By noon, Buckingham Palace had transformed into something resembling a war room. The communications team had been called in for an emergency meeting. Legal advisors were rushing between offices with briefcases full of documents, and the private secretaries were fielding phone calls from news outlets around the world. The story that had begun as a few online articles had exploded into international headlines, with every major news organization scrambling to get their own angle on the royal scandal. William stood in the palace's media monitoring room, watching multiple television screens showing coverage of what was already being called Camillagate. The coverage was more extensive and more damaging than even he had anticipated, and his amusement at the situation was growing by the hour. "Your Royal Highness," said James Hartwell, the senior communications advisor, approaching with a tablet displaying social media analytics, "the public response is significant. The story is trending on every platform, and the engagement numbers are unlike anything we've seen for a royal story since your grandmother's funeral." William glanced at the tablet, noting the millions of shares, comments, and reactions the story had generated in just a few hours. The public appetite for details about Camilla's deceptions seemed insatiable. "What's the general sentiment?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Mixed, but leaning heavily toward criticism of Her Royal Highness," James replied diplomatically. "Many people are expressing feeling deceived themselves, as though they had been manipulated into accepting a carefully crafted persona that wasn't authentic." On one of the television screens, a panel of royal experts was dissecting every aspect of the revelations. The discussion was animated, with historians, journalists, and former palace staff offering their perspectives on the implications of Camilla's deceptions. "The most damaging element isn't the affair timeline," one expert was saying. "The public has long suspected that relationship began earlier than officially acknowledged. It's the financial deceptions, the secret property ownership, and especially the payments to keep people quiet. These suggest a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond protecting privacy. They suggest active manipulation and potential corruption." William found himself nodding in agreement with the analysis. This was exactly why he had waited so long to allow these revelations to come to light. The story wasn't just about past indiscretions. It was about ongoing character flaws that called into question Camilla's fitness for her role as queen consort. His phone buzzed with a text message from Harry, who was calling from California. "Watching the news. Is it as bad as it looks from here?" William quickly typed back, "Worse. Sarah Mitchell's TV interview hasn't even aired yet." The response was immediate. "Should I come back to London?" William considered this. Harry's return would certainly add another layer of drama to an already chaotic situation, but it might also provide useful perspective. Harry had always been more skeptical of Camilla than Charles or even William himself had been, and His insights into the situation might prove valuable. Not yet, he replied. Let's see how today develops. Charles appeared in the doorway of the media room, looking haggard and older than William had seen him in years. The morning's revelations had clearly taken a toll, and the constant stream of phone calls and meetings hadn't helped his state of mind. How bad is it? Charles asked quietly, gesturing toward the television screens. Bad, William replied honestly, but not unsurvivable. The monarchy has weathered worse storms than this. Have we, though? Charles asked, sinking into one of the chairs arranged for viewing the monitors. A queen consort systematically deceiving not just the public, but her own husband? Using her position to profit from selling palace information to journalists? Making payments to keep people quiet about her past? I'm not sure we have dealt with anything quite like this before. William studied his father's expression, noting the mixture of hurt and confusion there. Despite having learned the truth from William the night before, Charles was still struggling to process the full extent of Camilla's deceptions. The question, William said carefully, is what we do about it. Do we try to minimize the damage and weather the storm, or do we acknowledge that this situation requires more decisive action? Before Charles could answer, one of the communications staff members entered the room with a laptop computer. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, she said urgently. Sarah Mitchell's interview has been moved up. It's starting now, and it's being broadcast live on multiple networks. All conversation in the room stopped as the laptop was positioned where both William and Charles could see the screen. The interview was taking place in what appeared to be a comfortable sitting room, with Sarah Mitchell facing an experienced journalist known for his probing questions about royal and political matters. Sarah looked older than William remembered from the few times he had met her years ago, but she appeared composed and determined as she settled into her chair across from the interviewer. Mrs. Mitchell, the journalist began, you've been living in Australia for over a decade, largely out of touch with your old friend Camilla Parker Bowles, now the Queen Consort. What prompted you to speak out now? Sarah's expression was serious as she answered. The truth has a way of demanding to be heard eventually. I've been keeping Camilla's secrets for 20 years, receiving regular payments to maintain my silence about things the public deserve to know. But when I returned to England for my mother's funeral, I realized I couldn't continue living with the weight of those secrets. What kind of secrets? The interviewer pressed. Sarah reached for a folder beside her chair and pulled out what appeared to be a transcript. I have recordings of conversations with Camilla spanning several years. Conversations where she discusses her strategies for managing public perception, her true feelings about various members of the royal family, and her methods for keeping certain information from becoming public. William felt a chill of anticipation. He had known about the recordings, but he hadn't heard their content. Even his extensive intelligence network within the palace had limits. Can you give us a specific example? The interviewer asked. Sarah consulted her transcript and read, this is from a conversation in 2019 after Prince Harry's wedding to Meghan Markle. Camilla said, quote, the boy has no idea how to handle the press, just like his mother. At least Diana had the decency to die at the height of her popularity. Harry's going to drag this family through years of embarrassment before he figures out that you can't fight the system. You have to manipulate it. The room fell completely silent. William glanced at his father and saw that Charles had gone very pale. Criticizing Diana was one thing, but suggesting that her death had been convenient for the royal family was something else entirely. There's more, Sarah continued. From a conversation in 2020, during the pandemic, when there was criticism of the royal family's response, Charles is too soft, too concerned with being liked. He doesn't understand that respect is more important than popularity. Sometimes you have to make people believe things that aren't entirely true if it serves the greater good. That's what leadership means. William found himself laughing, a sound that seemed inappropriate in the tense room, but which he couldn't suppress. The recordings were revealing exactly what he had suspected for years, that Camilla viewed manipulation and deception not as necessary evils, but as tools of effective leadership. Your Royal Highness? James Hartwell asked uncertainly, clearly concerned about William's reaction. Sorry, William said, though he didn't stop smiling. It's just that this is exactly what I expected. Camilla's entire worldview is based on the assumption that other people are too naive or too stupid to handle the truth, so she has to manage their perceptions for their own good. On the screen, Sarah was continuing her revelations. Camilla also discussed her relationship with various journalists, how she would feed them stories about other royal family members to distract from negative coverage of herself. She called it strategic narrative management, But it was really just manipulation. The interviewer leaned forward. Are you saying the Queen Consort was actively working to generate negative coverage of other royal family members? Not negative, exactly, Sarah clarified. But she would certainly emphasize certain stories or perspectives that made other family members look problematic by comparison. She was very strategic about positioning herself as the stable, mature influence in Prince Charles's life, even if it meant highlighting the instability or immaturity of others. William's laughter became more pronounced. He turned to his father and saw that Charles was staring at the screen with an expression of growing horror. This is fascinating, William said, his amusement clearly audible. She's been playing a chess game where everyone else thought they were just having casual conversations. She's been manipulating media coverage, managing family dynamics, and controlling information flow for decades, all while pretending to be the innocent victim of circumstance. William, Charles said quietly, this isn't amusing. This is devastating. It is devastating, William agreed. But it's also hilarious. Don't you see? All these years, we've been treating her like someone who was trying her best to navigate a difficult situation, when she's actually been orchestrating half the problems she was pretending to solve. On the television, Sarah was now playing actual audio recordings. The quality was clear enough that Camilla's voice was unmistakable as she discussed various strategies for managing public perception and family relationships. In one particularly damaging excerpt, Camilla could be heard saying, Charles thinks I'm protecting him from the worst of the press criticism, but really I'm just making sure they focus on the right targets. If they're writing about Harry and Meghan's problems or William's work-life balance struggles, they're not writing about Charles's age or my past. It's all about directing attention where it can do the least damage to us personally. William burst into actual laughter at this revelation. She's been using us as decoys. Our personal problems and challenges have been deliberately amplified in the press to protect her and father's image. Charles looked at his son with genuine concern now. William, you're laughing at something that should be making you angry. She's been manipulating all of us. I'm laughing because I figured it out years ago, William replied. I've been watching her do this, documenting her methods, waiting for someone else to catch on. The fact that it's all coming out now, in such a spectacular fashion, with her own voice providing the evidence of her deceptions, it's almost too perfect to believe. The interview continued with Sarah providing more examples of Camilla's strategic thinking and manipulative behavior. Each revelation was more damaging than the last, painting a picture of someone who had spent decades treating the royal family and the public as pieces in an elaborate game. There's one more recording I think people need to hear, Sarah said, consulting her notes again. This is from last year, when there was speculation about Charles's health and questions about succession planning. The audio quality was particularly clear for this excerpt, and Camilla's voice was unmistakable. If something happens to Charles, my position becomes very different. William will be king, and he's never trusted me completely. I need to make sure I have enough influence and enough allies that he can't simply push me aside. The key is to make myself indispensable to the institution, regardless of personal relationships. William's laughter stopped abruptly. This recording was different from the others. This wasn't just about managing public perception or media coverage. This was about planning for a future where she might need to protect herself from him. She's been preparing for a power struggle with me, he said quietly, his amusement finally giving way to something more serious. All this time, she's been building a network of influence and loyalty that she could use if she ever needed to defend herself against me. Charles was staring at the screen with an expression of complete devastation. She's been planning this for years. All of it. The manipulation, the deceptions, the strategic positioning. It's all been part of a long-term plan to secure her position regardless of changing circumstances. On the television, the interviewer was asking Sarah about the payments she had received from Camilla over the years. The money wasn't just to keep me quiet about the affair timeline, Sarah explained. It was to ensure I wouldn't talk about Camilla's methods, her strategic thinking, her true personality behind the public image. She knew that if people understood how calculated and manipulative she really was, it would destroy the carefully crafted persona she had worked so hard to build. William found his smile returning, though it was different now, colder, more satisfied. Do you know what the most beautiful part of all this is? He asked his father. Charles looked at him questioningly. She created her own downfall. Every recording, every payment, every strategic decision to manipulate someone or something. It all created evidence of exactly the kind of person she really is. She was so confident in her ability to manage information and control narratives that she never considered the possibility that her own words and actions would eventually be used against her. He gestured toward the television, where Sarah was now discussing the psychological impact of keeping Camilla's secrets for so many years. She thought she was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, William continued. But she forgot that the people she was manipulating might eventually figure out the game and decide to stop playing by her rules. Charles stood up slowly, his age seeming to weigh heavily on him as he processed the full implications of what they were watching. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly. William's smile became genuinely cheerful for the first time since the crisis began. Now we watch the rest of the palace staff figure out what we've known all along. We watch the press and the public come to terms with the fact that they've been systematically deceived for decades. And we decide what kind of monarchy we want to have going forward. He turned to face his father directly. But first we laugh. Because sometimes, when someone's web of lies finally collapses under its own weight, when years of careful manipulation finally backfire completely, when someone who thought they were smarter than everyone else gets outsmarted by their own arrogance, sometimes the only appropriate response is laughter. As if to demonstrate his point, Sarah's voice came from the television speakers, sharing yet another damaging revelation about Camilla's behind-the-scenes behavior. William listened for a moment, then burst into laughter again, genuine, delighted laughter at the spectacular nature of Camilla's downfall. And despite his concern about the situation, despite his hurt at years of deception, despite his worry about the monarchy's future, Charles found himself beginning to smile as well. Because his son was right. Sometimes the only way to deal with the collapse of something built on lies was to find the humor in watching it all come crashing down. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah Mitchell's explosive television interview, and the landscape of the British monarchy had changed in ways that no one could have fully predicted. The initial media frenzy had evolved into something more sustained and more serious, a genuine public debate about trust, transparency, and the future of the royal institution itself. Camilla had not been seen in public since the day after the story broke. She remained at Clarence House, effectively in self-imposed isolation, while legal advisors and communications experts worked frantically to assess the full extent of the damage to her reputation and position. The few statements released on her behalf had been carefully worded non-apologies that acknowledged misunderstandings while avoiding admission of any actual wrongdoing. William stood in his private office at Kensington Palace, reviewing polling data that painted a stark picture of public opinion. The monarchy's approval ratings had taken a significant hit, but, interestingly, the damage was not evenly distributed. Charles's numbers had dropped, but not as severely as might have been expected. Many people seemed to view him as a victim of Camilla's deceptions rather than a willing participant. William's own approval ratings had actually increased, with many viewing his handling of the crisis as evidence of strong leadership. But Camilla's numbers were catastrophic. Her approval rating had dropped to single digits, making her one of the least popular members of the royal family in modern polling history. More significantly, there was growing public sentiment that she should step back from her royal duties entirely, with some calling for her to renounce her title as queen consort. "The constitutional implications are complex," said Professor Margaret Thornton, William's constitutional advisor, as she reviewed the latest legal analysis. "There's no precedent for a queen consort voluntarily stepping back from her role while remaining married to the monarch. But there's also no precedent for revelations of this magnitude about deliberate deception over such an extended period." William nodded thoughtfully. The legal and constitutional questions were important, but he was more interested in the political and practical implications. The monarchy's survival depended not on legal technicalities but on public support, and that support was increasingly conditional on addressing the Camilla situation decisively. His phone rang, displaying Charles's private number. They had spoken several times since the crisis began, but the conversations had been difficult, with Charles struggling between his loyalty to his wife and his responsibility to the institution. "William," Charles's voice sounded tired when he answered. "I need to see you. Can you come to the palace this afternoon?" "Of course. How are you holding up?" There was a long pause before Charles answered. "I've been better. We need to discuss what happens next. This situation can't continue indefinitely." When William arrived at Buckingham Palace, he was struck by the unusual quiet in the corridors. The normal bustle of activities seemed subdued, as though the entire institution was holding its breath while waiting to see how the crisis would resolve itself. Charles was waiting in the same study where Camilla had made her confession 3 weeks earlier. He looked older, more fragile than William had ever seen him. But there was also something different in his bearing, a kind of resigned determination that suggested he had finally made some difficult decisions. "Sit down, William," Charles said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "We need to talk about Camilla's future role in the family." William took his seat, noting that his father's tone was more formal than usual. "What have you decided?" "I haven't decided anything yet," Charles replied. "But I've come to understand that this isn't really my decision to make alone. The damage to the monarchy's reputation affects all of us, and the solution needs to be something that serves the institution's interests, not just my personal preferences." This was not the conversation William had expected. He had anticipated having to convince his father that decisive action was necessary, not having Charles acknowledge the reality of the situation so directly. "What are you thinking?" William asked carefully. Charles pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be legal documents and polling data. "I've had extensive consultations with constitutional experts, communications advisors, and senior government officials over the past week. The consensus is clear. Camilla's continued presence in her current role is unsustainable." William felt a mixture of relief and concern. Relief that his father was facing reality, but concern about what this decision was costing him personally. "The question," Charles continued, "is how we manage her transition to a different kind of role. Complete withdrawal from public life would be the cleanest solution from a public relations perspective, but it might also generate sympathy for her and make the monarchy look callous. What alternatives are you considering?" "Reduced duties, carefully selected engagements, a gradual fade from prominence rather than an abrupt disappearance. She would retain her title but would essentially become a private figure who makes occasional ceremonial appearances." William considered this approach. It had the advantage of avoiding the drama of a complete break, but it also risked prolonging the negative attention and keeping the controversy alive. "Have you discussed this with her?" he asked. Charles's expression darkened slightly. "That's been challenging. Camilla doesn't see the situation the way we do. She believes this will all blow over if we simply wait it out. She's convinced that the public has a short memory for royal scandals, and that she can rebuild her reputation through charitable work and positive media coverage." "And you disagree?" "I think she fundamentally misunderstands what's happened here. This isn't just a scandal about past behavior. It's a revelation about character, about a pattern of deception that calls into question everything she's done and said for the past 20 years. You can't rebuild trust when people have evidence that you've been systematically manipulating them." William was impressed by his father's clear-eyed analysis of the situation. The man who had seemed so devastated by the initial revelations had apparently used the past 3 weeks to gain perspective on the full implications of Camilla's behavior. "There's something else," Charles continued. "Something I haven't told you yet." He pulled another document from the folder, this one bearing the letterhead of a major London law firm. "I've had investigators looking into Camilla's finances, trying to understand the full extent of her undisclosed activities. What they found goes beyond what we already knew about." William felt his pulse quicken. "What did they find?" "The Cornwall property was just the beginning. She owns 3 other properties under various shell companies and trust arrangements. She's been receiving regular payments from multiple media organizations for exclusive access and information. And she's been investing in companies that have business relationships with organizations she supports in her official royal capacity." The implications were staggering. If Camilla had been profiting from her royal position through undisclosed business arrangements, it wasn't just a matter of personal deception. It was potentially criminal. "Are we talking about corruption charges?" William asked quietly. "Possibly. The legal advice is that prosecution would be difficult because much of her behavior existed in gray areas of the law, but the ethical violations are clear and extensive." William stood up and walked to the window, processing this new information. When he turned back to his father, he was smiling, not with amusement this time, but with genuine satisfaction. "She's been running what amounts to a personal business empire using her royal connections, and she's been hiding it from everyone, including you, for years." That appears to be the case. And now it's all coming to light because she made the mistake of trusting Sarah Mitchell with too much information and underestimating the possibility that her secrets would eventually surface. Charles nodded. The investigators believe that Sarah's recordings represent only a fraction of Camilla's undisclosed activities. If she decides to cooperate further with journalists or law enforcement, there could be additional revelations that are even more damaging. William returned to his chair, his mind racing through the possibilities. What does she say when you confront her with this new information? She says she was protecting the monarchy by maintaining financial independence, that she never wanted to be a burden on the public purse, and that her business activities were completely separate from her royal duties. And you believe that? Charles was quiet for a long time before answering. I want to believe it. Despite everything, I love her, William. I've loved her for most of my adult life. But I can't ignore the evidence that she's been systematically deceiving me about fundamental aspects of her life and character. There was real pain in his father's voice, and William felt a surge of sympathy for the impossible position Charles was in. Loving someone and losing trust in them at the same time was one of the most difficult emotional challenges anyone could face. What do you need from me? William asked gently. I need you to help me figure out how to manage this situation in a way that protects the monarchy while treating Camilla with as much dignity as possible. I know you've never been fond of her, and I know you probably think she deserves whatever consequences come her way, but she's still my wife. William was surprised by his father's direct acknowledgement of his feelings about Camilla. They had never discussed his reservations about her so openly before. You're right that I've had concerns about her, William said carefully. But I take no pleasure in seeing you hurt by this situation. Whatever we decide to do, we'll make sure it's handled with discretion and respect for your relationship with her. Charles looked up with something like gratitude in his eyes. Thank you. That means more to me than you might realize. They spent the next hour discussing practical arrangements for managing Camilla's transition to a reduced role, legal strategies for addressing the financial irregularities, and communication plans for explaining the changes to the public without creating additional drama. As their meeting was concluding, William's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and couldn't help but smile. What is it? Charles asked. A message from Harry. He's been watching the coverage from California, and he wants you to know that he's proud of how you're handling this situation. He says it shows the kind of leadership the monarchy needs. Charles looked genuinely moved by this message. His relationship with Harry had been strained for years, and expressions of support from his younger son had become rare. Harry also says, William continued, reading the rest of the message, that he's been laughing about Camilla's situation for weeks. He says it's the most entertainment the royal family has provided in years. Despite everything, Charles began to chuckle. Your brother always did have a dark sense of humor. He says he particularly enjoyed the recording where Camilla talked about directing negative press attention toward him and Meghan. He's thinking of using it as evidence in his next interview about why he needed to distance himself from the family. Charles's chuckle became actual laughter. Of course he is. Trust Harry to find a way to turn Camilla's downfall into vindication for his own choices. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of them processing the events of the past few weeks and the decisions that lay ahead. Finally, Charles spoke again. You know what the strangest part of all this has been for me? William waited for him to continue. The relief. Despite the pain of discovering how extensively she's been deceiving me, despite the damage to the monarchy, despite the personal embarrassment, there's been this underlying sense of relief that the truth is finally out in the open. Relief about what specifically? About not having to pretend anymore that I didn't notice the inconsistencies in her stories, that I didn't have questions about her past, that I was completely satisfied with partial truths and managed explanations. It's been exhausting, William, trying to have an honest relationship with someone who was fundamentally dishonest. William nodded.